A routine day takes a suspicious turn. Officer Emma Cole stood outside the precinct, her hand gently resting on her badge, feeling its familiar weight. For Emma, the badge was more than just an emblem of authority. It was a symbol of the responsibility she had sworn to uphold. With a sigh, she adjusted her hat and slid into her patrol car. The early morning sun cast a golden hue over the quiet streets as she cruised through the neighborhood, her eyes alert to any sign of disorder. Emma's days were predictable, filled with minor infractions and routine patrols, but today something felt different, a tension she couldn't quite place. As she drove, she passed through a part of town that was changing. Gentrification had altered the landscape, turning old mom-and-pop stores into sleek cafes and boutiques. But there was still a mix of new and old, and Emma had come to view this neighborhood as a place where rules were often stretched or outright ignored. A group of teenagers loitered outside a corner store, their voices loud, their laughter carefree. Emma frowned. Loitering, while not a crime, often led to more significant issues, or so she believed. She slowed the car and rolled down her window. "Move along," she said firmly, her tone leaving no room for negotiation. The teens grumbled but began to disperse, casting annoyed glances in her direction. Emma watched them leave, feeling that familiar sense of satisfaction. She wasn't here to be liked. She was here to enforce the law, to keep order in a world that seemed to grow more chaotic by the day. As the day wore on, Emma's mood soured. It seemed like no one was following the rules. She ticketed a car for parking over the line, scolded a pedestrian for jaywalking, and warned a cyclist for riding on the sidewalk. Each infraction, no matter how minor, grated on her. Why couldn't people just follow the rules? By mid-afternoon, Emma was drained. She pulled into the parking lot of her favorite cafe for a break, but even her coffee tasted bitter. She caught her reflection in the glass window. Her face looked stern, hardened. Somewhere along the way, the joy of helping her community had been replaced by a rigid need for control. After her break, Emma decided to stop by the grocery store on her way home. The evening air was cooling, and the parking lot was dotted with cars as people hurried to finish their shopping. She grabbed a basket and wandered through the aisles, trying to unwind. But then she saw her. A young black girl, no more than 15, stood in the cereal aisle, her eyes wide as she scanned the shelves. Emma's pulse quickened. The girl seemed nervous, her hands shaky as she picked up a box, studied it, then put it back. Something about the way the girl moved raised Emma's suspicions. Emma stepped closer, her eyes narrowing. The girl, Leela, looked around nervously before grabbing a second box of cereal, only to replace it again. To Emma, it looked like she was waiting for an opportunity to do something wrong. Her police instincts flared to life. Even off duty, Emma couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen. She discreetly trailed Leela, watching her every move. Leela wandered through the aisles, her actions seemingly harmless, but Emma saw every movement through a lens of suspicion. The girl kept glancing around, her posture tense. Was she trying to steal something? Emma's mind raced. She had to act before anything happened. When Leela paused near the self-checkout, hesitating before picking up a candy bar, Emma's heart raced. That was it, the proof she needed. Emma strode forward, her posture firm, the weight of her authority in every step. "Excuse me," Emma's voice cut through the quiet of the grocery store. Leela froze, her eyes wide with fear as she turned to face the officer. Emma folded her arms, her gaze stern. "What do you think you're doing?" Leela's lips quivered, and her voice was barely above a whisper. I'm just shopping." Emma raised an eyebrow, unimpressed. "Just shopping, huh? You've been acting suspicious ever since you got here." "I didn't do anything wrong," Leela protested, her voice shaky, but filled with sincerity. Emma wasn't convinced. Years of experience had taught her that people lied, especially when they were caught red-handed. "Empty your pockets," she demanded. Leela's eyes filled with tears, but she did as she was told, pulling out her phone and some loose change. There was no stolen merchandise, nothing incriminating, but Emma wasn't satisfied. Something felt off, and she wasn't about to let it slide. "I know what I saw," Emma said, her voice cold. "You're coming with me to the front of the store." Leela's heart pounded in her chest as Emma grabbed her arm, leading her toward the front. Shoppers stopped and stared, whispering to one another as they passed. Leila felt her face burn with shame. She hadn't done anything wrong, but no one would believe her now. The sight of a police officer dragging her through the store would leave little room for doubt in their minds. As they approached the front, the store manager rushed over, concern etched across his face. "What's going on here?" he asked, his eyes flicking between Emma and Leila. "This girl was acting suspicious," Emma said, her grip on Leila's arm tightening. "I think she's been trying to steal." "I wasn't stealing," Leila cried, her voice breaking. "I swear I wasn't." The manager looked uncertain, glancing at Leila's tear-streaked face, but before he could respond, a voice boomed from behind them. "What is going on here?" Emma turned around, her eyes widening in shock. A tall, imposing man stood at the entrance of the store, his presence commanding the attention of everyone around. He was dressed sharply, his posture confident. And when his eyes landed on Leila, they softened with recognition. "Dad!" Leila cried, running toward him. Emma's mind raced. Who was this man? And why did his arrival make her feel like her entire world was about to be turned upside down? The unforeseen truth. Leila dashed into her father's arms, tears streaming down her cheeks as she buried her face in his chest. The tension in the store grew thick, and for a moment, it felt like time itself had slowed down. Officer Emma Cole stood frozen, still gripping the handle of her basket, her mind whirling as she tried to process what was happening. The man who had just entered was no ordinary father. He was someone important. That much was clear by the way he carried himself, his commanding presence, and the aura of respect that seemed to follow him. His dark suit was impeccably tailored, and his eyes, though warm toward his daughter, flickered with an intensity that made Emma's stomach churn with uncertainty. "Dad," Leila whispered, barely able to contain her sobs. "She thinks I was stealing." The man, tall and imposing, slowly turned his gaze toward Emma. There was no anger in his expression, but the weight of his stare made Emma's throat dry. For the first time in years, Emma felt the rigid confidence she usually wore as an officer begin to falter. He walked calmly toward Emma, his footsteps slow and deliberate, never breaking eye contact. The other shoppers had begun to whisper more fervently now, wondering who this man could be and what would happen next. "I'm sorry, officer, but there seems to be some confusion," he began, his voice steady yet authoritative. "My daughter doesn't steal. I would appreciate it if you let her go." Emma's fingers tightened around her belt. Her instinct to assert control kicked in. She couldn't let this man's cool demeanor shake her resolve. The law was the law, and as far as she knew, Leila had been acting suspiciously. She had no choice but to act. "With all due respect," Emma said, her voice firmer than she felt, "I saw her behaving suspiciously. She was picking up items and putting them back repeatedly. It looked like she was waiting for the right moment to steal." The man didn't flinch. Instead, he glanced at Leila, who still clung to him, and then back at Emma. "She's a child," he said softly, yet there was something dangerous in the gentleness of his voice. "Children are often indecisive. That doesn't make them criminals." Emma could feel the eyes of the entire store on her now. Every customer, employee, and even the manager had stopped what they were doing to watch this confrontation unfold. She hated it. She hated the way her control of the situation was slipping, but more than that, she hated the nagging feeling in her gut, the one that whispered she was making a mistake. Leila's father took a deep breath and let it out slowly, as if to steady himself. Then, with a calmness that belied the gravity of the situation, he said, "Perhaps I should introduce myself. My name is Daniel Richards." There was a beat of silence. The name struck Emma as vaguely familiar, but she couldn't place it. That was until the store manager stepped forward, his face draining of color. Mr. Richards," the manager stammered. "I'm so sorry. I didn't recognize you at first." Emma's confusion deepened. Who was this man that even the store manager was suddenly deferential? She shifted her weight, her discomfort growing as Daniel Richards locked eyes with her once more. "I'm a civil rights attorney," Daniel explained, his tone firm but measured. "I've spent the better part of my career fighting against false accusations and wrongful arrests. What you've done here today is profiling." Emma's heart sank. This was not going the way she had expected. The weight of his words settled heavily on her. She had heard stories about racial profiling, and while she had always believed she was fair in her actions, the realization that she might have unconsciously judged Leila based on her appearance gnawed at her conscience. "I didn't," Emma started, but Daniel held up his hand. "I'm not accusing you of anything malicious, officer," Daniel continued, his voice calm but pointed. "But I need you to understand the gravity of what you're doing. Leila did nothing wrong, yet you assumed she was guilty based on a hunch." Emma felt a heat rise to her face, her earlier confidence unraveling with every word he spoke. She glanced around the store again, realizing that everyone was still watching her, waiting to see what she would do next. Emma paused, struggling to find the right words. Her training hadn't prepared her for this. "I'm just doing my job. I can't ignore suspicious behavior." Daniel's expression didn't change. "And I understand that. But sometimes what looks suspicious is just a misunderstanding. You must learn to look deeper than the surface." Emma swallowed hard. This was not the first time she had been accused of being too rigid, too quick to judge. Her colleagues at the precinct had even joked that she was like a robot, programmed to follow the rules without exception. But now, faced with the reality of her actions, she wasn't sure if she could defend them. Daniel knelt down beside Leila, his large hand resting gently on her shoulder. "You okay, baby?" Leila nodded, though the tears in her eyes told a different story. She looked up at her father with a mixture of relief and shame. "I wasn't doing anything wrong, Dad. I was just trying to decide what cereal to get." Daniel smiled warmly at his daughter. "I know, sweetheart. And I'm proud of you for staying calm." He stood up and faced Emma again, his gaze softer now, but still resolute. "You see, Officer Cole, there's a bigger picture here. I spent years fighting to protect people from assumptions like the one you made today. This might seem like a small mistake, but these moments can have lasting impacts. If Leila had been taken into custody, what do you think that would have done to her?" Emma's chest tightened. She didn't need him to answer. She already knew. The sight of a young girl in handcuffs, the humiliation, the trauma, it would have stayed with her for the rest of her life. Emma had seen it happen before, to others. Innocent people marked by moments of misjudgment. The realization hit her like a wave. She had been wrong. Not in her intention, but in her approach. In her need to control every situation, she had lost sight of the humanity behind the badge. Emma took a deep breath, steadying herself before speaking. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice quieter than before. "I didn't mean to jump to conclusions." Daniel studied her for a moment, then nodded slowly. "Acknowledging the mistake is the first step, but you also have to learn from it." Emma nodded, the weight of his words sinking in. She had prided herself on upholding the law, on maintaining order. But now she understood that sometimes upholding the law wasn't enough. Compassion, understanding, and empathy had to come first. As Emma watched Leila and her father leave the store, she felt a deep shift within her. For the first time in a long while, she questioned the rigidity with which she had approached her job. Was there more to being a good officer than just following the rules? And if so, how could she change? The thought lingered with her as she walked to her car, the evening sky darkening above. Tomorrow, she would go back to the precinct. But tomorrow, she would be different. A new perspective. The next morning, Officer Emma Cole sat at her kitchen table, nursing a cup of coffee, her mind far from at ease. The events of the previous evening weighed heavily on her, replaying in a constant loop. Lila's tear-streaked face, Daniel's calm but commanding demeanor, and the word profiling echoing in her ears. It had all been a shock to her system. Emma had spent years building a reputation as a no-nonsense officer who followed the rules without hesitation. To her, the law was black and white, clear and precise. Yet, in one encounter, Daniel Richards had managed to crack the foundation of everything she believed in. She was left with a gnawing sense of self-doubt, questioning whether she had been doing her job correctly all along. Her phone buzzed, jolting her from her thoughts. It was a message from her partner at the precinct, Officer Ryan Matthews. "We've got a meeting this morning. Chief wants to address community concerns. Be there at 9. Emma frowned. Community concerns. That was an unusual directive. She glanced at the clock. 8:30. With a sigh, she stood, downed the last of her coffee, and headed out the door. The precinct was buzzing with activity when Emma arrived. Officers milled about, checking files, making calls, and preparing for their shifts. As she made her way through the halls, she felt eyes on her. She could sense the weight of yesterday's encounter with Layla still hanging over her. The story had already made its way around the precinct. Officer Cole accused a young black girl of stealing, but her father's a civil rights attorney. It didn't go well. "Hey, Emma." Ryan appeared beside her, his face serious. "You ready for this meeting? I hear the chief's not too happy." Emma nodded, though her stomach twisted in knots. "Yeah, let's get it over with." The meeting was held in a small conference room at the back of the precinct. Chief Laura Daniels stood at the front, her arms crossed, her face set in a deep frown. She was a tall woman in her mid-50s, with sharp eyes that missed nothing and a reputation for being both tough and fair. The room was filled with officers, each wearing varying expressions of curiosity and concern. "All right, everyone," Chief Daniels began, her voice carrying authority. "We've got a problem. There's been an increase in complaints about how we're interacting with the community, and last night's incident only added fuel to the fire." Emma's heart sank. She knew exactly what the chief was referring to. Chief Daniels' eyes swept over the room, finally landing on Emma. "Officer Cole, would you like to explain what happened yesterday?" Emma felt every pair of eyes in the room shift toward her. For a moment, she considered defending herself, explaining that she had only been doing her job, that Lila's behavior had seemed suspicious. But something stopped her. It was the memory of Daniel Richards' calm voice, and the truth behind his words. She realized that her usual defense wasn't going to cut it this time. "I'd made a mistake," Emma admitted, her voice steady but quiet. "I thought the girl was acting suspiciously, but I was wrong. I let my assumptions cloud my judgment." The room was silent, and the weight of Emma's words seemed to settle over everyone. Chief Daniels nodded slowly. "Mistakes happen," the chief said, her tone softer now, "but we need to learn from them. Officer Cole, you're not the only one guilty of this. We've all been there, letting our instincts take over without considering the bigger picture." Emma glanced around the room and saw a few of her colleagues nodding in agreement. She had always believed that she was simply following the rules, but now she realized that others had made similar snap judgments without considering the potential harm. Chief Daniels continued, "This precinct has a duty to serve everyone in our community fairly. Profiling, whether conscious or unconscious, is something we cannot tolerate. We need to do better. And that's why I'm implementing mandatory bias training for all of you, starting today." A murmur of surprise rippled through the room, and Emma's pulse quickened. Bias training. She had heard about programs like this before, but had always dismissed them as unnecessary. Now, after everything that had happened with Leela, she wasn't so sure. "Officer Cole," Chief Daniels said, turning her attention back to Emma, "I want you to be the first to go through the training." Emma's chest tightened. It felt like a reprimand. though the chief's tone wasn't unkind. Still, it stung. But deep down, she knew it was necessary. She had a lot to learn. "Understood, Chief," Emma replied quietly, avoiding the eyes of her colleagues. The meeting wrapped up, and as the officers filed out of the room, Ryan lingered behind, waiting for Emma. "You all right?" he asked, his voice filled with concern. Emma shrugged, her shoulders heavy with the weight of the morning. "I don't know. I guess I've got a lot to think about." Ryan gave her a sympathetic smile. "You're not the only one who's made a mistake like that. The important thing is you recognized it. You're a good cop, Emma. Just keep learning." Emma appreciated the support, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she had a long way to go. "Thanks, Ryan. I'll be all right." That afternoon, Emma sat in the precinct's small training room, waiting for the bias training session to begin. She was joined by a handful of other officers, all of whom looked equally uncomfortable. The training officer, an outside expert named Dr. Jasmine White, entered the room with a calm, confident demeanor. "Good afternoon, everyone," Dr. White began, her voice warm but firm. "We're here today to talk about bias, how it affects our decisions, and how we can be more aware of it. Being a police officer is tough. You're constantly in high-stress situations, and sometimes you have to make split-second decisions, but we need to make sure those decisions aren't influenced by unconscious bias." Emma shifted in her seat, feeling a mix of discomfort and curiosity. This was new territory for her, admitting that she might have been influenced by bias. She had always seen herself as a fair officer, someone who treated everyone the same. But now, she was beginning to understand that treating everyone equally didn't always mean treating them fairly. Dr. White continued, her words sinking deeper into Emma's mind. "The goal of this training isn't to make you feel guilty. It's to help you recognize when your judgments might be clouded by assumptions, stereotypes, or past experiences. We all have bias, whether we're aware of it or not. The key is learning how to identify it and adjust our actions accordingly." Emma's thoughts drifted back to Leila and Daniel Richards. She had been so sure of herself, so certain that Layla was guilty of something. But why? Was it because Leila had been nervous, or was it because Emma had seen too many crime reports that involved young black teens? The realization hit her hard. Her mind had made connections that weren't fair, and Leila had paid the price for it. As Dr. White led them through various exercises, Emma began to see how her experiences as a police officer had shaped her perceptions in ways she hadn't recognized. Every day, she dealt with people from all walks of life, and over time, patterns had formed in her mind. But those patterns weren't always accurate, and they certainly didn't account for the humanity of each individual. The session was long and uncomfortable at times, but by the end, Emma felt a shift within herself. She didn't have all the answers, but she had taken the first step toward understanding the complexities of her role and the need for empathy in her work. Later that evening, Emma returned home, exhausted but hopeful. She sat down at her kitchen table once again, the same spot where she had been only hours earlier, consumed by doubt. But now, her mind was clearer, her perspective broader. She picked up her phone and hesitated for a moment before sending a message to a number she had gotten earlier that day. "Mr. Richards, I'd like to apologize again. I've started bias training today, and I'm committed to doing better. Thank you for opening my eyes to something I needed to see." As she put down the phone, Emma felt a sense of relief. It was a small step, but it was the right one. Tomorrow, and the days that followed, would bring new challenges. But for the first time in a long while, she felt ready to face them with an open heart and a new sense of purpose. A test of change. The morning sun had barely risen when Officer Emma Cole sat in her patrol car, parked at the edge of the city park. The streets were quiet, only the occasional jogger or cyclist passing by as the city slowly woke up. Emma took a deep breath, her fingers resting on the steering wheel as she gathered her thoughts. Today was her first day back on patrol since the bias training, and though she felt somewhat more prepared, The weight of self-doubt still lingered. It had been a few days since her encounter with Daniel Richards and his daughter, Leela, but the impact of that day still reverberated through her. She couldn't stop thinking about it, how close she had come to shattering an innocent girl's sense of safety and trust. The training she had undergone had been eye-opening, but now came the real challenge, applying what she had learned in the field. Emma glanced at her phone, where a message from Chief Daniels was still fresh on her screen. Be mindful today. It's about progress, not perfection. Her eyes drifted toward the neighborhood beyond the park, an area she had patrolled dozens of times. It was a mix of old brick homes and newer developments, with a community that had seen its share of change over the years. Today, though, it felt different. Everything did. It was as though Emma was seeing the world through new eyes, trying to balance her duty as an officer with a deeper sense of responsibility toward the people she served. Just as Emma was about to start the car and begin her patrol, a call crackled through the radio. Officer Cole, we've got a disturbance reported at the Main Street grocery. Possible theft in progress. Suspect is a young female, mid-teens, wearing a red hoodie. Emma's heart sank. The location, the description, it was too familiar. Her mind flashed back to Leela, and for a brief second, her old instincts surged, but then she caught herself. This was exactly the kind of situation her training had been preparing her for. She had to approach this differently. She grabbed the radio. Copy that. Officer Cole responding. When Emma arrived at the grocery store, the scene was eerily reminiscent of the last time she had been here. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, and the air smelled faintly of cleaning supplies, mixed with the metallic chill of the store's freezer section. She took a deep breath, reminding herself to stay calm and open-minded. At the entrance, the store manager, a middle-aged man named Steve, who Emma had encountered on her regular patrols, waved her over. His face was lined with concern, his eyes darting nervously around the store. Officer Cole, thanks for coming. We think we got a problem here. A girl was acting strange in the back, and when we checked the cameras, it looked like she might have taken something. She's still inside. Emma nodded, trying to push past the initial surge of suspicion. Let's talk to her first before we make any assumptions, she said, more to remind herself than to guide Steve. The two walked toward the back of the store, where the girl in question was sitting on a bench near the employee break area. She looked to be about 14, her red hoodie pulled tightly over her head as she stared at the ground. A small backpack sat at her feet. Emma couldn't see her face clearly, but the slouched posture and the tension in her body reminded Emma of how Leela had looked that day, scared, vulnerable, and uncertain. Emma approached slowly, her heart thudding in her chest. She had to get this right. Hey there, Emma said gently as she crouched down to eye level with the girl. I'm Officer Cole. Can I talk to you for a minute? The girl didn't look up, her fingers twisting nervously in her lap. Emma stayed quiet for a moment, letting the girl process her presence. She didn't want to push too hard too soon. I know you're probably feeling a little scared right now. Emma continued, keeping her voice soft. But I'm here to help, okay? I just want to understand what's going on. The girl shifted slightly, her hoodie slipping back to reveal her face. Emma saw that she was younger than she'd first thought, maybe 13. Her dark eyes were filled with fear, but also something else, shame. I didn't mean to, the girl whispered, her voice barely audible. I was hungry. Emma's stomach dropped. The girl wasn't some petty thief. She was just a kid in need. Her heart ached as she realized how easily this situation could have escalated, how quickly assumptions could lead to harm. What's your name? Emma asked gently. Zara, the girl mumbled. Okay, Zara, Emma said, her tone kind. I'm not here to get you in trouble. Can you tell me what happened? Maybe we can figure this out together. Zara hesitated, glancing down at her backpack. Her small hands trembled as she slowly unzipped it, revealing a couple of items, some bread, a bottle of water, and a small bag of chips. nothing more. Emma's heart clenched. This wasn't theft born out of malice. It was desperation. "I don't have money," Zora said quietly, her voice cracking. "My mom's sick, and I didn't know what else to do." Emma felt a lump form in her throat. She knew she had to be careful, but she also couldn't ignore the reality of Zora's situation. This wasn't about breaking the law. It was about survival. She turned to Steve, who had been watching the exchange, his expression softening. "Steve," Emma said, "I don't think this is what you were expecting. Zara's just trying to take care of herself and her mom. Maybe we can handle this a little differently." Steve looked from Emma to Zara, his earlier frustration giving way to understanding. "I didn't realize," he muttered, his voice trailing off. "If I'd known, I would've. I don't know." Emma stood up, addressing Steve with a firm but compassionate tone. "I get that it looked bad on the cameras, but we got to look at the bigger picture here. This girl doesn't need punishment. She needs help." Steve nodded slowly, rubbing the back of his neck. Yeah, you're right." Emma crouched down again, facing Zara. "Listen, Zara, I'm not going to arrest you. You're not in trouble, okay? But I need to know if there's anyone you can talk to, anyone who can help you at home." Zara shook her head, tears welling up in her eyes. "It's just me and my mom. She's been sick for a while, and I've been trying to take care of her. But I don't know how to pay for food. I didn't want to steal. I really didn't." Emma's heart broke. She knew that if she hadn't taken the time to listen, if she hadn't approached this situation differently, Zora might have ended up in a very different place, one where a criminal record would follow her for the rest of her life. "Okay," Emma said softly, placing a hand on Zora's shoulder. "Let's see if we can figure something out. We'll get you some food, and then I'll help connect you with some people who can support you and your mom, all right?" Zora's eyes widened in disbelief. "You'd really do that?" Emma smiled, though it was tinged with sadness. "Of course. We're going to make sure you're taken care of." With a quiet nod, Zora finally allowed herself to relax, and Emma stood up to talk to Steve again. "Can we work something out?" she asked, her voice hopeful. Steve sighed, glancing at Zora. "Yeah, I'll cover the cost of the items. She doesn't need to pay for anything." Emma smiled gratefully. "Thank you, Steve. You're doing the right thing." After a few more moments of conversation, Emma and Zara walked toward the store's exit together. As they reached the door, Emma felt a strange mix of emotions: relief, hope, but also an overwhelming sense of responsibility. She had been given a second chance to do things right, and this time, she hadn't let her assumptions get in the way of seeing the truth. Zara glanced up at her voice small. "Thank you, Officer Cole. I didn't think anyone would help." Emma's chest tightened, her throat suddenly dry. "I'm just doing my job, Zora. But thank you for trusting me." As Emma watched Zora disappear down the street, a strange sense of peace settled over her. It wasn't perfect. There was still so much more work to be done. So many more people who needed help. But it was a start. And for the first time in a long while, Emma felt like she was on the right path. The unexpected crisis. Officer Emma Cole sat in the precinct's break room the next morning, staring at her cup of coffee as if the answers to her recent questions might float to the surface. The conversation with Zora the day before had weighed heavily on her. Though she had handled the situation with empathy, the encounter left her deeply reflective about her role as an officer. Emma was beginning to understand that every interaction had the potential to either build or destroy trust, especially within marginalized communities. The old way of enforcing the law without considering the human context was starting to feel insufficient. But change, real change, was harder than it seemed. As Emma stared out of the window, her phone buzzed on the table, jolting her from her thoughts. It was a message from Chief Daniels. "Emma, I need you to report to the scene of an escalating situation in District 5. We've got a tense situation at a local high school. There's been an altercation involving a student and a teacher. Dispatch is already on it, but I need you there too. This one might need a delicate touch." Emma's heart raced as she quickly grabbed her things and headed out. District 5 was a diverse, densely populated part of the city, known for its vibrant community, but also for occasional tensions between students and school staff. As Emma drove, her mind buzzed with questions. What kind of altercation had taken place? And why did Chief Daniels specifically ask for her? The thought unnerved her, but she tried to stay calm. When she arrived at the high school, the atmosphere was thick with tension. A few police cars were already parked outside, their lights flashing. Emma spotted Officer Ryan Matthews, her partner, speaking with a group of students who stood huddled together, looking anxious. Ryan waved her over. "Hey, Emma. It's a bit of a mess inside." "What happened?" Emma asked, scanning the students for any signs of distress. Ryan rubbed the back of his neck. There was some kind of altercation between a black student and a teacher. Things escalated quickly, and now both the student and the teacher are in the principal's office, but the student's family is on their way, and they're not happy. There's a lot of tension here, and I think Chief Daniels sent you because she thought you might be able to de-escalate things. Emma's chest tightened. It wasn't just about the incident. It was about the trust, or lack of it, that had been brewing between the school and the community. She took a deep breath. "Let's go inside." The school hallway felt like a powder keg, with students and staff clustered in small groups, whispering anxiously. The air was thick with suspicion and uncertainty. Emma and Ryan made their way to the principal's office, where they found Principal Howard pacing nervously outside. "Officer Cole, thank you for coming," Principal Howard said, wringing his hands. He was a tall man in his early 50s, with a weathered face that betrayed the stress of years spent managing a large urban high school. "What's going on?" Emma asked, her tone calm but firm. The principal sighed. "There was a disagreement between one of our teachers, Mr. Donovan, and a student named Malik Johnson. Things got heated, and Malik pushed the teacher. It's complicated, though. Malik says Mr. Donovan made some racially insensitive comments, but the teacher claims Malik was being disruptive. Now the boy's parents are on their way, and they're furious. They've had issues with the school before, and I'm worried this is going to escalate into something much bigger." Emma nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation. Malik's family likely felt that this wasn't just an isolated incident. It was part of a larger pattern of racial tension within the school. She glanced at the door to the office, where the boy and the teacher were waiting. This wasn't just about keeping the peace for the day. It was about addressing the underlying issues that had brought them to this point. "I'll talk to them," Emma said, her voice steady. "But we need to be prepared for the conversation to be difficult." Principal Howard nodded, though he looked more anxious than before. "Please, do what you can." Emma entered the office, her heart pounding as she took in the scene. Seated on one side of the room was Malik, a tall, lanky boy with a sharp, intelligent gaze. He sat stiffly in his chair, his fists clenched in his lap, though his eyes betrayed a sense of injustice and hurt. Across from him sat Mr. Donovan, a middle-aged man with thinning hair and an air of frustration. He looked flustered, his arms crossed tightly across his chest, as if trying to maintain control of the situation. Emma positioned herself between them, sensing the charged energy in the room. "Let's start by calming down," she said, her voice even. "I'm Officer Cole, and I'm here to help resolve this. But first, I need to hear from both of you. Malik, why don't you start by telling me what happened?" Malik glanced up at her, his eyes narrowing slightly as if wondering whether she would really listen. After a tense pause, he began to speak, his voice tight with emotion. "I wasn't doing anything wrong," he said, his words measured but angry. "I was asking a question about the assignment, and Mr. Donovan got all mad. He told me I wasn't paying attention, and that I should know my place. I don't know what he meant by that, but it didn't feel right. I told him he couldn't talk to me like that. And then he said something about me always being disruptive. I wasn't gonna just sit there and take it." Emma felt her stomach clench. Know your place. It was a phrase with deep, troubling connotations, especially in a classroom setting where a teacher should be fostering growth and respect. She turned to Mr. Donovan, who looked flustered. "Mr. Donovan," Emma said, keeping her voice neutral. "What's your version of events?" The teacher shifted in his seat, his face flushed. "Look, I don't know where this is coming from," he said defensively. "Malik's been a disruptive student before. He's always talking back, not following directions. I wasn't trying to be offensive. I just meant that he needed to respect the classroom rules, like all the other students. I didn't say anything racial." Emma glanced between the two of them. She could see how the situation had spiraled out of control. Both felt wronged, both were defensive, and both were refusing to see the other's perspective. But Emma knew this was about more than a classroom disruption. It was about power dynamics, about racial tensions that had likely been simmering for months, if not years. Just as she was about to speak, the office door burst open, and in walked Malik's parents, his mother, a petite woman with fierce eyes, and his father, a tall man with a commanding presence. Their faces were filled with a mix of anger and protectiveness. "Where's my son?" Malik's father demanded, his voice booming as he spotted Malik sitting stiffly in the chair. "What is going on here?" Emma stepped forward quickly, trying to prevent the situation from escalating further. "Mr. and Mrs. Johnson, I'm Officer Cole. We're here to talk this through. Please, have a seat. Let's figure this out together." Malik's mother crossed her arms, glaring at Mr. Donovan. "Talk this through. My son says his teacher made racist remarks, and you want to talk. This isn't the first time we've had problems with this school." Emma nodded. "I understand. And I'm here to make sure we address all of your concerns. But first, we need to get to the bottom of what happened." Mr. Johnson's jaw clenched as he looked at his son, who was staring at the ground, his body still tense with frustration. "Malik doesn't make things up," he said. "He wouldn't lie about something like this." Emma felt the tension in the room rise again. She knew she had to de-escalate things before they got worse. "Let's take this one step at a time," she said calmly. "I believe everyone here wants the same thing. For Malik to feel safe and respected, and for this situation to be resolved fairly. We need to listen to each other, and we need to be honest about what's happening." There was a pause, and then Mrs. Johnson spoke, her voice filled with pain. "My son comes to this school to learn, not to be humiliated. This isn't the first time he's come home upset because of how he's been treated by teachers. We've tried talking to the principal before, but nothing changes." Emma could see that this was about much more than just today's incident. It was about years of feeling unheard, about the frustration of raising a black child in a system that often failed to recognize its own biases. She turned to Mr. Donovan, her voice firm but not accusatory. "Mr. Donovan, I understand that you have a classroom to manage, and I'm sure you didn't intend to cause harm. But words matter, and how we speak to our students, especially in moments of frustration, can have a lasting impact. I think we need to acknowledge that." Mr. Donovan opened his mouth as if to argue, but then closed it, his face softening slightly. "I didn't mean for it to come across that way," he said quietly. "I was frustrated. But I realize now that what I said was wrong." Emma nodded, turning back to Malik. "Malik, I want you to know that your feelings are valid. No one should make you feel disrespected in your classroom. We're going to make sure that this gets addressed, and that it doesn't happen again." Malik looked up, his eyes still wary, but there was a flicker of relief in his expression. His father placed a hand on his shoulder, nodding in agreement. "We want him to feel safe here. That's all we're asking for." Emma turned to the principal. "I think we need to have a real conversation with the school about how to address these underlying issues. It's not just about this one incident. It's about making sure every student feels respected and heard." Principal Howard nodded, looking more humble than before. "We'll take action. I promise." As the tension in the room finally began to ease, Emma felt a sense of cautious hope. It wasn't a perfect resolution, but it was a step toward understanding, toward healing. She had come here to de-escalate a crisis, but she had ended up helping open a dialogue that could change the way the school handled these situations in the future. As she left the school that day, Emma couldn't help but feel that her work was just beginning. There were so many layers to these problems, and each one required patience, understanding, and a willingness to see things from another's perspective. She was learning to be more than just a law enforcer. She was learning to be a bridge. The decision that changes everything. 2 weeks had passed since Officer Emma Cole's tense encounter at the high school. During that time, she had spent countless hours reflecting on her role as a police officer and the way she interacted with the community. The situation with Malik and his family had been a wake-up call, but it was just the latest in a series of incidents that had caused Emma to question not just her actions, but the entire system she worked within. She had always believed in justice, in the rule of law, and in her ability to protect and serve. But lately, Emma had begun to see cracks in that belief. It wasn't that she doubted the importance of law enforcement, but rather that she was starting to understand that policing couldn't simply be about following the rules. It had to be about understanding people, about recognizing the humanity in each interaction. It had to be about fairness, empathy, and change. As she sat in her car outside the precinct that morning, the weight of everything pressed heavily on her shoulders. She had an important decision to make, one that would determine the course of her future, not just as an officer, but as a person. Her phone buzzed, breaking the silence. It was a message from Chief Daniels. "Emma, I need you in my office. There's something important we need to discuss." Emma's heart skipped a beat. She had been expecting this call. After the incident at the high school, she had been working more closely with the community, taking part in discussions about racial profiling, systemic injustice, and the role of law enforcement. She had been vocal about her growing concerns and had even challenged some of the precinct's long-held practices, but not everyone was receptive to change. With a deep breath, Emma stepped out of the car and headed inside. As she made her way through the precinct, she noticed the usual bustle, officers filing reports, answering calls, preparing for their shifts. But something felt different. She could sense the eyes of her colleagues on her, some filled with curiosity, others with something less kind. When she reached Chief Daniels' office, she knocked lightly on the door. "Come in," the chief's voice called from inside. Emma opened the door and stepped in, finding Chief Daniels sitting behind her desk, her expression serious but not unkind. She gestured for Emma to sit, and Emma did, trying to steel herself for whatever was coming next. "Emma," Chief Daniels began, folding her hands in front of her, "I've been watching your progress over the past few weeks. You've been doing good work, important work, especially with the community outreach efforts. Your involvement in the Malik Johnson case made a real difference." Emma nodded but didn't say anything. She wasn't sure where this conversation was heading, and she didn't want to jump to conclusions. The chief continued, her tone softening. "But I can see that you've been struggling with something. You've been more distant with your colleagues, more reflective. I've noticed the change in you, Emma, and I have a feeling that this job is weighing on you more than it used to." Emma felt her chest tighten. The chief had always been direct, but today there was something more, something personal, in her words. Emma looked down at her hands, trying to find the right words. "I have been struggling," Emma admitted finally, her voice quiet. "Everything that's happened lately, the incident with Leela, the high school, it's made me question a lot. I've always believed in what we do here, Chief. I've always believed in the law. But I'm starting to wonder if the way we enforce it is just as I thought." Chief Daniels didn't respond right away. She leaned back in her chair, studying Emma carefully before speaking. "You're not wrong to question things. The system isn't perfect, and it's not easy for someone in your position to challenge it, but you have been. That's admirable, but I can see it's taking a toll on you." Emma met the chief's gaze, feeling a lump form in her throat. She had never been one to let her emotions get in the way of her work, but now, with everything she had experienced, it felt impossible to keep the two separate. "I don't know if I'm making a difference," she said, her voice wavering. "I don't know if I can do this job the way it's supposed to be done and still feel like I'm doing the right thing." Chief Daniels leaned forward, her eyes soft but serious. "Emma, every officer faces this at some point in their career. The conflict between enforcing the law and ensuring justice isn't always clear-cut. But the question you need to ask yourself is this: do you still believe in the work we're doing? Do you think you can be part of the solution?" Emma looked down at her badge, feeling its weight more than ever. She thought about Leela, about Zara, about Malik and his family. Each of those encounters had shown her that policing wasn't just about arresting the bad guys. It was about preventing harm, protecting the vulnerable, and challenging the very structures that created inequality in the first place. "I don't know if I can keep doing this the same way," Emma said finally, her voice steadying as she spoke the truth she had been holding in for so long. "I want to help people. I want to make a real difference, but I'm not sure I can do that as a cop, not with the way things are right now." The room was silent for a moment. Chief Daniels sat quietly, letting Emma's words settle in. Then she nodded slowly. "I had a feeling you might say that." Emma blinked, surprised by the chief's response. Chief Daniels smiled, though it was a sad smile, tinged with understanding. "You're not the first officer to feel this way, Emma, and you won't be the last. The truth is, this job isn't for everyone, not because they aren't strong enough, but because it requires a certain mindset. You've always been more reflective, more focused on the bigger picture. That's what makes you a great officer. But it's also why this work might not fit who you're becoming." Emma's heart sank. She had always thought that if she ever left the force, it would be on her terms, after years of service. But now, sitting in front of the chief, she realized that her departure might come sooner than expected, and for very different reasons. "I don't want to walk away from helping people," Emma said softly. "I just don't know if this is the way to do it anymore." Chief Daniels stood up and walked around her desk, leaning against it as she faced Emma directly. "There are many ways to serve, Emma. Policing is just one of them. If you feel like your heart is pulling you in a different direction, that's not a failure. It's growth. And you need to follow that." Emma swallowed hard, her mind racing. She had spent years as an officer, dedicating her life to the idea that she could make the world a better place by upholding the law. But now, after everything she had seen, she wasn't sure if that was enough. "What would you do?" Emma asked quietly, looking up at the chief with a mix of hope and uncertainty. Chief Daniels smiled again, this time with a touch of warmth. "I can't tell you what to do, but I can tell you this. The world needs people like you, people who care, who see the bigger picture, and who aren't afraid to ask hard questions. Whether you decide to stay on the force or find another way to serve, I know you'll make an impact." Emma felt a sense of relief wash over her, though it was bittersweet. The decision was hers to make, and it wasn't going to be easy. But for the first time in a long while, she felt like she had clarity. She knew what she needed to do. Later that afternoon, Emma found herself back at the park, sitting on a bench overlooking the quiet playground. The sounds of children laughing in the distance and the rustle of the autumn leaves were soothing, but her mind was still heavy with the weight of the decision she had to make. She thought about the past few years, about the lives she had touched, both positively and negatively. She thought about Zara, about how one act of compassion had likely changed the course of the young girl's life. And she thought about Malik and Leela, two children whose futures had almost been derailed by assumptions and bias. Emma knew that if she stayed in the force, she could continue to fight for change from within. She could push for more training, more awareness, and more accountability. But she also knew that real change often came from outside the system. And maybe, just maybe, her role wasn't to be part of the institution anymore. Maybe it was to advocate for something bigger, something deeper. The sun was setting, casting a golden glow over the park. Emma took a deep breath, feeling the cool air fill her lungs. She reached into her pocket and pulled out her badge, staring at it for a long moment. It had once been a symbol of pride for her, but now it felt like a reminder of the conflict she had been carrying inside. Slowly, deliberately, she placed the badge on the bench beside her. She wasn't walking away from the fight. She was choosing a different battlefield.